Welcome to the Engaging People podcast. I'm your host, Cecily Jorgensen, and today we are listening to a roundtable discussion that our DecisionWise Consultants had about employee voice. And to help you kind of understand how we think about this issue of employee voice at DecisionWise, I wanted to read some of the questions that we put on our employee engagement surveys to help us measure employee feelings on how well the organization is listening. So some of those questions are, I feel that I can share my ideas and opinions without fear of negative consequences. Another one is, we listen to and evaluate each other's thoughts and opinions. This organization values employees' input, feedback, and suggestions. And the last one is, the organization is responsive to ideas and suggestions for improvement. So with these questions in mind, let's dive into some of the thoughts and experiences our consultants have had. Senior consultant Charles Rogel started the conversation addressing why employees may not speak up.
Sometimes in organizations where, for example, there's long-term, long-tenured employees, where employees will stay there a lot of times in government organizations or semi-government organizations. You're going to be there for the rest of your career. You've got a pension kind of riding on this, and so you're not willing to really shake things up or create waves, so to speak, because you don't want to make your job any worse than it already is. You don't want to create any negative consequences, obviously. So the idea is that if there's a lot riding on your employment, this kind of fosters this environment where people aren't speaking up. They just don't care. Manager said do it this way, so we're just going to do it this way. So you start hearing voices less and less. And so if you're wondering if this is happening in your organization, you need to look at how meetings are run. Do people kind of share dissenting opinions within meetings, or question some of the decisions being made or the direction that's being set? Are there questions afterwards? Does this is it pervasive throughout the organization? Sometimes we just see this in pockets where it's a certain manager that kind of leads with an iron fist and doesn't allow kind of dissension in the ranks, so to speak. So it could be only localized where we see it. Sometimes the organization itself doesn't really encourage dissenting opinion either. So it might be run by a few individuals or an executive team that really wants to lead the direction. So it kind of manifests itself in different ways. It could be, like I said, more localized or pervasive across the organization. In other organizations I've worked with where it's encouraged, they want people to share opinions. They want people to disagree and discuss disagreements and come to a kind of a coalition or an agreement on things. And they do it in such a way because they want to get rid of this this negative notion of groupthink, where we're all just kind of yes men and agreeing with things that are going on. So from framing the discussion, what does it look like? Those are some of the examples that I've seen.
Principal consultant Dan Hoops now shares a story illustrating how one company he consulted for deliberately put mechanisms into place to show their employees that their leaders were listening and doing something with their feedback.
The culture of this organization was such that they were always looking at ways of staying in contact with the front lines. Well, the headquarters was based in San Diego. A lot of the front lines were in different places throughout the United States. A lot of them were in Tucson, Arizona, some were in other locations. And the senior leadership team had become so disconnected from the front lines that it was very evident in, hey, we're trying to improve this product, and the feedback wasn't making it up. So not only were they not being responsive, but they weren't evaluating that input. And they implemented a mechanism with the leadership team that you could not come to the executive staff meeting every week unless you had talked to at least 1 to 2 people on the front line and got their perspectives of what was going on inside the business. And they termed it a listening post. And for the first 30 to 45 minutes of the executive meeting was all about, what are we hearing from the business? And are we delivering for the customers? Are we creating a great employee experience? And they really began to value that frontline perspective, especially because they're the ones that are on the phone providing that support day-to-day with the clients. I think the part of the key word is, what do we do as an organization to put mechanisms in place that show that we do value the input and feedback, and that we're closing the loop of, hey, we've actually done something with it.
As we continued in our discussion, we touched on the fact that not all leaders in an organization know how to both listen and understand their employees' viewpoint. So, Principal Consultant Beth Wilkins has had a long career working with and coaching executives, and she shared an example of an executive that knew how to both solicit feedback and then champion that feedback all the way back to the top.
There was an organization I was working with. It was an engineering organization, and there were some people that provided customer support. So they had a lot of interaction with the customers. They knew what their concerns were, and the executives seemed a little detached. But this executive recognized that there wasn't communication flow, and so as a solution, he decided to bring people together, bring some of the people who he felt were his top talent together, and basically he gave them some of the questions, issues that he heard coming up, and he said, all right, you're closest to the customer, I want you to think through how we solve these problems. And to his credit, he made it into a really big initiative. So not only were they working on these really meaningful problems, but he and some of his executives got together and they had basically a report out. So it was an executive panel that listened to the solutions that the top talent came up with. And then, they gave them feedback so that they could modify them and things like that. But together, they were able to come up with some really great, innovative solutions. And others in this company saw their example and started to replicate that same experiment, if you will. But it was really engaging to those people in the organization, and it helped the executives come up with better solutions that met customer needs.
But what more does a leader need to be seen as someone who listens? VP of Consulting Services Christian Nielsen added the trait of vulnerability in this comment.
I was presenting to an employee population where I was presenting their engagement results, and it was interesting because there was a new CEO there, and he was kind of getting to know the population at the same time I happened to be there. And he went through and said, hey, I've toured all of the facilities. I'm really excited about the energy, and I want to tell everyone that I don't have all the answers. I didn't come with all the answers, but I know good ideas when I see them. And it was really interesting just to be vulnerable and kind of appeal to the employee population, saying the best ideas aren't going to come from me. They're going to come from you, and I'm going to champion them and make them a success. And so he kind of had the luxury of being a new leader and starting fresh with that population, but that has always stayed with me, and I've shared that with other clients in terms of it's okay, and it's the right thing to do, is to open it up and to be willing to say, I don't have all the answers. We need people closest to the customer, closest to the issues themselves to help solve these problems, and to share stories that celebrate that, how this project was an idea that so-and-so had, and it came from a real life problem that a client encountered, and we're all better because of it. And so those types of things create and reinforce culture, and can really help boost the responses or the favorability on some of these questions tied to voice.
Christian Nielsen reminds us that being vulnerable might mean not only admitting you don't have all the answers, but also admitting that you can't act on every single suggestion. So he models how this conversation might look between managers and their direct reports.
If an employee has an idea and we can't do it, just how powerful it is just to tell them we can't do it and why. And otherwise they feel like they haven't been heard, or they feel like their ideas were judged. And if you say, yeah, we can't do that right now because of X, Y, and Z, and me as an employee might say, well, I have additional information on X, Y, and Z as well. It can help take it down the path a little bit more, but it also just helps an employee feel validated and part of something instead of marginalized or excluded from the process.
Another thing we talked about was how companies can start with very small changes. And Charles and Dan Decca had some kind of funny stories about changes some companies should have made sooner and some records they needed to set straight with employees.
I'll add, as an organization, if you're trying to improve in this area and it hasn't been working well in the past, it does take time. It takes a couple effort or iterations, because if your employees, if you've taught them learned helplessness and they don't, they feel like, well, it doesn't matter if I speak up, nothing ever happens. When you start asking them for suggestions or ideas or to express their thoughts and opinions, they could just hold back. They're just going to say, well, I'm going to wait. I'm not going to be that guy or that person that speaks up first. There could be some legacy experiences in your organization where, I remember working with one organization where people referred to an experience where someone spoke up and got fired. And when I shared that with the executive team, they said, that's never happened around here. What are they referring to? That's crazy. And so even if the event never happened, it's something that was imagined and got kind of baked into the employees' thoughts and ideas and was shared. So you have some hurdles maybe to overcome. So it takes time and effort to build the trust, to start getting the ice to kind of flow, so to speak, and to create this culture. It takes some time.
When Charles and I were also on this site at this engagement summit, this guy brought up this example. He said they work at a mine, and so it's a really dusty area, and they had this dust sweeping machine, and they would drive it around, but it wasn't working correctly, so it wasn't sucking up the dust. It would just spin everything around and like create more dust, but it wasn't sucking it up, and everybody knew it. But for 2 years, they were paying somebody to drive that thing around and just kind of move dust around. And then finally, somebody's just like, well, can we stinking fix that machine? And they fixed it. They just put it up so it would actually suck up dirt. And then it, obviously people saw that. So a lot of times there are these emblems or these tokens of, like, oh yeah, somebody got fired for this. And a lot of times they may be based on some fact, but there's often like this reinforcing token that is like proving some story. And if you change that token, like, oh, management doesn't care or listen to our ideas. Look, they've got a street sweeper that doesn't sweep up dust. It just moves it around. If you change it and actually get a real duster, that can change the story a lot. And then actually what's interesting too, we talked a little bit about it, you have to actually tell people, hey, by the way, we changed that. I don't know if you all noticed, but we heard for you guys it wasn't working. We actually changed it. And have you noticed it's working a lot better? Sometimes you have to be explicit about that. So that was just another thought around communication, looking for the emblems that anchor the old stories. And can we change something?
As we continued our conversation, Christian Nielsen made a really important point that leaders need to be reminded to see employees as peers, sharing information and best practices. So here are his thoughts on how to go into a meeting and evaluate people's thoughts and opinions rather than dismissing others' ideas.
Innovation is often a competency that's low in terms of how a manager's direct reports feel like, or they promote innovation and creativity on a team or something like that. And so we talk about the conversation of learning to recognize when you're brainstorming and when you're editing, and in terms of, is it, you can enter into idea generation sessions or hear people without shooting down ideas. And it's interesting to get into MBTI for intuitive versus sensing in terms of that, because for example, I have preference for sensing, and so when ideas are generated, I very quickly go to why they won't work, because I can think very tactically around, okay, well, there's these other factors that will make that difficult, and there's a time for that as you get into roadmaps and things like that. But there's also a time to just freeform, let people be heard and get ideas out on the table, and so I think there's an interesting self-awareness aspect to just knowing when are we idea generating and when are we idea selecting or critiquing, and just being able to manage yourself accordingly.
We eventually shifted our conversation to what employees can do to help their own voices to be heard. If you believe that employee engagement is a 50-50 proposition, then we have to talk about what the employee can do to remain engaged, even if their organization isn't the best at showing them that they listen. And if we're all looking at each other as peers, I shouldn't have a problem with trying to help my manager be a better manager with my own knowledge or actions. And so Dan Hoops comments on this trap of learned helplessness.
I think for me, you go back to the work of Martin Seligman and learned helplessness. I think we get caught in that trap too often of, I'm not getting the information that I need, or, there's gaps in the information or the feedback that's coming. Well, then go and ask. I don't think a person is a jerk, if you will, by saying, hey, this is a gap that's missing in my information, or can I just share an idea with you, or can I just bounce a proposal off you? So when we think of engagement as a 50-50 proposition, I think the same thing happens with communication. They can't wait to be acted upon, if you will, and learned helplessness of, they didn't tell me that. Well, then go and ask. I think that's a self-imposed cultural mindset versus the reality of what happens in the businesses.
So when it comes to the part that we as employees play in this 50-50 proposition, it serves us better to ask questions. Even if we feel someone should be communicating with us and giving us the information, we'll probably feel happier at work if we are proactive despite the choices of others. And so both Charles and Christian go on to talk about the balance of asking questions and bringing up our own ideas and kind of the etiquette, especially when you are new to a company. So let's see what Charles and Christian had to say.
I've seen employees in the past, some that are very enthused, maybe just started working with the organization, and they come up with 20 different ideas about how they could improve the organization within their first week of work. And they're coming with, usually the conversation starts off with, well, at my last organization, we did something this way. And so what I've seen is if they come off too strong and are really trying to come up with maybe too many suggestions, they will quickly maybe not lose credibility, but there'll be too much noise. There's too much to consider. And so you need to be kind of strategic in terms of your suggestions, ideas, things that you really want to change, and maybe even suggest it as a special project that you want to take on as one of your goals or development goals, however you want to phrase it. But you're trying to enact change in a more strategic way. You have to realize it's a big organization. Change takes time. You can't change everything overnight. Not all of your suggestions will be listened to, but be patient, but be deliberate and keep trying.
But I do like the idea of being sensitive, especially if you're a new joiner to an organization, being sensitive to kind of honor the past and understand that there might be information you don't have, but still go forward and try things and bring. One of my favorite definitions of, or maybe it's my own definition of employee engagement, is when we're engaged when we feel empowered to bring more of our best self to work. Well, if our voice is stifled, that's the opposite of that. That's less of our self. And so it doesn't necessarily mean we get to come in and change the dress code, do whatever we want, but there's got to be a way for us to find how to be our authentic self and to incorporate more of that into our work and bring our best ideas.
As our discussion came to a close, I wanted to make sure that we talked about managers in a very human way. Sometimes it's too easy to see our managers as an authority figure that might be micromanaging us. We may not always see them as our ally. But I think shifting your thoughts about your manager to, hey, they are a person with strengths and weaknesses. They are trying to manage a lot, and they don't have all of the answers. I can maybe be of help to them. That thought helps us interact with them in a more compassionate way. And so Christian and Beth share some ways that we as employees can actually help our managers listen to us better.
Marshall Goldsmith has this great thing about asking for help. and what it does to just, if you have a manager that's maybe not supportive of when you bring up ideas, ask them for help, saying, I have this thing, this idea, can you help me figure out a way to maybe implement this on a trial basis, or to at least further explore this, or to test this idea. It's an amazing thing when you ask someone for help versus, hey, I want to do this. You ask someone for help, and it does this interesting psychological thing where they get them on your side. Now, it's not foolproof. I've been using it to manipulate all of you for a number of, but it can at least soften maybe some of the barriers that have been there before.
Another thing I experienced as a manager was that most often employees were telling you about the problems, and it became something that was actually heavy. It's like, oh, I'm gonna hear a laundry list of problems again in this one-to-one. I so appreciated it and listened better when people had a solution attached to the problem. So I would recommend that employees think about that. If I want to be heard, what kinds of things can I suggest that would actually make my manager's life easier, or that would make executives' lives easier?
And so, as you can see, there are a lot of ways to look at this idea of employee voice. And I think that each comment and story showed us that there are many lenses and angles. And I also think at the end of the day, if you're showing your employees that you listen and that you are changing based on their survey responses, you'll probably start to see your scores and comments improve. And so I think most organizations want to attract and keep the rock stars. But those people are going to come with some strong voices and a desire to be heard. So I think organizations should keep trying to engage their employees and really show them that they are listening. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Engaging People podcast. Visit DecisionWise.com for more episodes and to learn more about employee engagement and our offerings.